Today we're going to talk about the spiritual being. What is the spiritual being? Who is the real you? The person behind the mask. What is the spiritual being? Well, let's start off with a quote from the Upanishads. And it goes, "In the beginning was only being, one without a second. Out of himself he brought forth the cosmos and entered into everything in it. There is nothing that does not come from him. Of everything, he is the inmost self. He is the truth. He is the self supreme. You are that, my friend. You are that." And that was said during a conversation that was taking place in the Upanishad. Highly recommend to get yourself a copy, and of obviously a copy that's translated into English or something that you can read. These are really profound books that provide a lot of deep insights to provide you with the tools that you need to properly decipher a lot of these spiritual texts and to have the spiritual understanding that you need to really elevate your understanding. And so in order to understand this spiritual being, which we're going to call the self, and the reason we call it the self is because we need to understand that it is about you. Everything about spirituality is about you. It always has been and it always will be. When we as a society or a civilization realize that all that is required to fix society and fix everything around us is by first uplifting ourselves, taking care of ourselves, correcting all the bad habits that we have and the bad thought processes that we have as individuals. If all of us took care of ourselves and clean up our own act, the world will ultimately take care of itself, and virtually all the problems of the world would fade away. And the reality is that this is the real good news. This is the true good news that was written and preached about by Christ, right? And the news itself, unfortunately, has been convoluted and misused and manipulated to control people, unfortunately. But that's why we are here, to decipher the truth and to help you to come to the truth of who you really are. And it's a beautiful thing. And so how do we reach or get to know this being called the self? We must first establish a foundation based in information and experience. Because the reality is, information can only get you so far. And experience itself provides you with the adequate insight to thoroughly understand an idea or something that someone else is trying to express to you. When you can experience that for yourself, you truly embody what that person was trying to say when you experience it yourself. So experience itself is truth, and truth itself sets you free. So you can gather all the knowledge you want, but without true experience, and it does take work to get these experiences of enlightenment and awareness. When you put in the work, you get these experiences, right? And I'm not saying that knowledge is not good. It's good to accumulate this knowledge because it helps you along the path. But in order to really define yourself and to know yourself and to experience the being within, knowledge gets you so far, but experience itself is the key. That is what we're aiming for, is the experience. So we must base or establish ourselves in, like I said, information and specifically experience. And I want to emphasize the idea of experience, specifically experience, because you cannot attain enlightenment without experiencing it yourself. And it could happen at any time. We do know of stories of, for example, Muhammad, who never read a text in his life, became awakened, enlightened, and that's how he was able to put forward the Quran and these holy books. Again, another set of texts that has been convoluted and misrepresented. So a lot of times you don't necessarily need to read to become enlightened. The experience itself is what we're looking for. That is what we're aiming for, to really allow us to become the beings that we always have been and that we're supposed to be, and the experience we're supposed to be having in this lifetime right now. Because after all, information without experience ultimately it's speculation. And speculation will only make a fool out of you and I. We see it with, and again, I'm not trying to bash any particular religion or anything like that, but
I would have been swallowed up. Have you ever been swallowed up? Have you gone through a time of swallowing where everything was overwhelming? And
but this is facts. We're talking about reality here, right? So we see a lot of speculation without experience within the Christian belief system or the Catholic belief system. A lot of the pastors and the preachers, they go about convoluting the text and misrepresenting and misinforming the public of the text, thus causing more confusion without true experience. And the reality is, these pastors and preachers don't have the prerequisite understanding in order to help you appropriately understand what is being said in these religious texts. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have the keys necessary to understand what the teachers were trying to say, you will end up more confused and lost than you originally intended. So you need the appropriate keys. That's why I mentioned that if you can read things like the Upanishads and read texts outside of the Bible, it'll further help you along the way and provide you with the keys that you need to properly understand what is being said within these texts. Now, some of the great teachers of the past have made reference to the self in the form of sayings that are utterly straightforward. However, because the mind of the masses are not appropriated with the necessary insights, they cannot grasp what is being explained. And similarly, I cannot explain it myself, but I will try to guide you along the path. Okay? The idea is that you need to experience it. So some of the great teachers of the past, and the reason I say teachers because before I actually dive into the next part of this, I want you to understand that when I say teachers, I am talking about enlightened beings. And these enlightened beings come in the form of names such as Buddha, Thought, Christ, and Krishna. Those four I'm going to quote for you. But I don't want you to think of a specific or a particular individual when I say these names. For these names are actually just titles given to someone who is enlightened. So for instance, if you're enlightened or you're awakened, you're the Buddha. I am the Buddha. Everyone's the Buddha. Everyone's the Christ. Everyone's Thought. Everyone is Krishna. Because these names are primarily labels. Labels for people who are enlightened, like I said. But ultimately, they are just titles. The same way we call somebody who graduated from theology school, we call them a pastor or a preacher. That is what these names similarly, that is what these names represent. They are titles of highly spiritual being. So let's look at some quotes that was expressed by these beings who are different individuals throughout time. And another example of this is, for example, Thought. They say that Thought and Hermes Trismegistus or Hermes Trisgreat, they are both the same people. And again, if someone by the name of Thought lived, how many thousand years ago in the ancient Egyptian land, how could he be alive during the time of the Greeks, right? So the reality is that these are titles that were given to men throughout time as people realize that these men aren't ordinary men. They are not like the average individual. They are spiritual beings like you and me, but we haven't received the title of Buddha or Thought or Christ as of yet, but the hope is to get there one day. So here's a quote expressed by Thought. Your light, O soul, is the great light, shining through the shadow of flesh. Free, you must rise from the darkness before you are one with the light. Here's another one from Buddha. You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. And here's one from Christ. A lot of people, again, don't see through the lines and unfortunately misinform the people. And Christ says, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Here's another one by Sri Krishna. The soul is never born nor dies at any time. Soul has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. Soul is unborn, eternal, ever existent, and primeval. Soul is not slain when the body is slain. And that's in the Bhagavad Gita. And so what are these teachers trying to express? What are they trying to get across to us? Well, they're trying to express that the real you, the true you, you're not the body who you've been convinced to think you are, but you are a being made of pure light that dwells within. And this being is yet to be discovered. So in the search for self, or in the search to define who you really are, I believe you should have an existential experience or some sort in order to come to an understanding and realization of the self. Now, this can happen to you at any time in many different ways. Realistically, it comes down to where you are in your state of mind or in your state of being. If you're familiar with Zen and the Zen Buddhist teachings, now you can have these experiences at any time. You can simply be walking on the road and it can happen to you. At least that's what the Zen Buddhists believe. They believe that it can happen to you at any time. You don't need to be in a particular environment or situation in order to have a existential or an experience that helps you to realize yourself. If you're familiar with the Zen Buddhist teaching or the discipline, the ultimate aim of the Zen discipline is to attain what is known as Satori. The Lankavatara Sutra, as a Zen text, naturally emphasizes the importance of Satori, which is defined here as the state of consciousness in which noble wisdom realizes its own inner nature. And self-realization constitutes the truth of Zen, which is an emancipation, known as moksha, and a freedom, known as yasavartin. Forgive me if I butcher that name. So Zen teaches that the ultimate aim is self-realization, or an emancipation of the self, of the soul. And as a matter of fact, rather than me explaining it, why don't I share with you a Zen story between a master and a student? It's a little bit wordy, but we'll get through it. So the student asked, how does one come to this emancipation face to face? How does one get to this realization? The teacher answered, a man comes to this emancipation face to face when his mind is enlightened and stands in a most intimate relationship to it. For then he attains self-realization in all that he perceives and understands. Does one attain self-realization by listening to the talks and discourses of enlightenment? That is not so. Why? Because enlightenment sees intimately into the truth and reality of all things. The student asked, is it not that thinking comes from hearing, and that by thinking and reasoning one comes to perceive what suchness is? And is this not realization? The teacher replied, this is not so. Self-realization never comes from mere listening and thinking, O son of good family. I will illustrate the matter by analogy. Listen, in a great desert, there are no springs or wells. In the springtime or in the summertime when it is warm, a traveler comes from the west going eastward. He meets a man coming from the east and asks him, I am terribly thirsty. Pray, tell me where I can find a spring and a cool, refreshing shade, where I may drink, bathe, rest, and get thoroughly revived. The man from the east gives the traveler, as desired, all the information in detail, saying, when you go further east, the road divides itself into two, right and left. You take the right one, and going steadily forward on, you will surely come to a fine spring and a refreshing shade. Now, son of a good family, do you think that the thirsty traveler from the west, listening to the talk about the spring and the shady trees, and thinking of going to that place as quickly as possible, can be relieved of thirst and heat and get refreshed? The student replied, no, he cannot, because he is relieved of thirst and heat and gets refreshed only when, as directed by the other, he actually reaches the fountain and drinks of it and bathes in it. Only then. And the teacher replied, son of a good family, even so with the Bodhisattva or the Buddha, by merely listening to it or thinking of it and intellectually understanding it, you will never come to realization of any truth. Son of a good family, the desert means birth and death. The man from the west means all sentient beings. The heat means all forms of confusion. Thirst is greed and lust. The man from the east who knows the way is the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, who abiding in all knowledge has penetrated into the true nature of all things and the reality of sameness. To quench the thirst and to be relieved of the heat by drinking of the refreshing fountain means the realization of truth by oneself. Again, son of a good family, I will give you another illustration. Suppose the Tathagata has stayed among us for another kalpa and used all kinds of contrivance, and by means of fine rhetoric and apt expression, had succeeding in convincing people of this world as to the exquisite taste, delicious odor, soft touch, and other virtues of the heavenly nectar. Do you think that all the earthly beings who listened to the Buddha's talk and thought of the nectar could taste its flavor? The student replied, no, indeed not. And the teacher said, because mere listening and thinking will never make us realize the true nature of enlightenment. By what apt expression and skillful illustration, then, can the Bodhisattva lead all beings to the true understanding of reality? The student asked, or the teacher replied, sorry. The teacher replied, the true nature of awakening as realized by the Bodhisattva or the Buddha, this is the true definitive principle from which all his expressions issue. When this emancipation is realized, he can aptly give expression to it and skillfully illustrate it. From this, we can distinctively be convinced that awakening, which emancipates, is something which must be personally experienced by us, and that mere hearing about it, mere learning of it, does not help us to penetrate into the inner nature of reality itself. And he goes on to say that it cannot be put into words, etc., etc., etc. Needless to say, I don't know if I need to explain that story, what was said there, but ultimately, you have to experience it for yourself. The search of self or enlightenment is an interesting journey, one in which everything you've come to know as truth crumbles before your eyes. And what it does is it leaves an infinite empty space inside you. Now, this space is not quite empty particularly. That's because this emptiness is filled with light. This light can be associated with the awareness of self, the awareness that we are one with the source of life, the place from which all things comes. And so, with all that being said, how do we have these profound experiences that reveals the self or allow us to become enlightened? How do we go from being the average everyday Joe to being someone who now sees beyond the veil and sees self for who we truly are and sees the self ultimately? Well, I simply recommend that you start to meditate. Meditation is the key. This is the ultimate place to start. That is by inquiring into oneself so that the inner eye, also known as the third eye or your first eye, your inner vision can be remembered. And this remembrance is like taking your inner light out of a chest that hides it, or taking off a tight clothing that does not fit you well. This is where we start meditation. And meditation itself is a practice. What it does for you is it helps you to step back from your five senses and the ego so you can truly see yourself. And so here's a couple things to do while you meditate. This will help speed up the process for self-discovery. Be mindful. Always be in a state of mindfulness. Practice being in love, being in a state of love. Practice being in a state of peace, joy. And all of this comes when you meditate. You find all of this when you meditate. Meditation, for me, is a refueler. When I sit and I meditate, I refuel myself, I refuel my soul. And it helps me to stay sure of self and be confident in myself. And to know that even though everything in this world may not be the way I want it to be, or I may not have achieved all the things I wanted to achieve, this world itself is temporal. So the experience that I'm having is a good one. And yes, I can project a better reality and enhance it. But I am grateful for awareness. I am grateful for the fact that I am aware of my eternity. I am aware that I am infinite, and that this experience I'm having now is merely the beginning of my coming into truth of self and the remembering of who I really am. It is said that when Buddha sat in meditation, he could look back and see his last 10,000 lifetimes. It is said that other great teachers and other extremely spiritual beings can sit in meditation and relive some of their previous lifetimes. So meditation itself is the place to start, to discover the self. And so another thing I recommend to do or to think about as you go about your day, as you meditate and you go about your days. This also helped me along the path and helped me to further enhance my experience of being a spiritual being. And that is to serve God. Serve God in everything you do. And how do you do that? That is by having compassion for others, treating others with love, treating yourself with love, with patience. Because the reality is, when we serve others, we serve God. Because we are that. What we are ultimately is, we are two rays of light, two different rays of light that emanate from the same sun. So you and I are the same, but we are only different in the physical form. We're not necessarily different in the physical form either. We're also the same in the physical, but we have different identities. Just so we can separate ourselves and call ourselves who we are and differentiate ourselves from each other. But we're ultimately all the same. God experiencing himself or herself, whatever you choose to refer to it as. So embrace your fear, embrace the pain of change. This pain is nothing but a dying of the old self and a reawakening of who you really are and who you've always been and who you will always be. That is until you fall asleep again. That is until you decide to plug yourself back into the matrix, or in your next lifetime you fall asleep again, whichever one you choose, or you could ultimately just stay awake. And with that, I will leave you with a quote by Rumi. It is simple and it is to the point, and I hope you grasp it. And it says, "The wound is the place where the light enters." With that, peace out. Oh yeah, please, as always, like, subscribe, share the video, comment below if you found value in it, you found some insights. Let me know what you think. Give me your feedback. The goal ultimately is to grow the channel and to reach more like-minded, spiritually dedicated people like me and you, and to grow the channel. So please like, share, subscribe, and you know the standard YouTube vibes. Yeah, appreciate it. Till next time.